Okay, so the 2024 Louisiana Project Grants, the application is currently open. It opened on May 1st and it will close on June 30th at 5 p.m. So during this time, if you have any questions about the guidelines, questions about if you wonder if your project is eligible, I usually encourage especially first-time applicants to really read through the guidelines to make sure that your project does align with the guidelines criteria. But overall, if you have any additional questions, like I said, you can reach out to me. I'll be available until June 1st or really May 31st. And then during June, you would reach out to Erica, which I'll leave her email by the end of this presentation in the chat. After applications are submitted, that first week of July, our organization is going to be on break. So the following week is the week that we use to review all the applications and check for eligibility, make sure that your application is eligible for the grant, it meets the criteria. So if it doesn't meet the criteria, which we'll go over, then you'll essentially get a message saying, your application didn't meet the criteria, and it'll specify what that criteria is. So you definitely just want to make sure your project meets the eligibility and the criteria. So, you don't feel like you've wasted your time on application and then you ended up missing something. So after we check for the eligibility of the applications, then the grant panelists, they're going to have about 3 to 4 weeks to review your applications. And they're going to have their discussions. So there's going to be 3 separate panel groups, which I'll go over later, which is going to be broken up. So everyone's going to review your applications. They're going to provide the recommendations. And then following that, you're going to get a message through Submittable. So I'll talk again more about Submittable later. Submittable.com is the grants management website that the state and ourselves use for the application submissions, as well as where the grant panelists, they review the applications, they leave their scores, and things like that. So you'll receive a notification through Submittable if you've been awarded or not. And also during that week, if you are not recommended for funding, then you can reach out for any kind of feedback or notes that the panelists may have left on your application. If you do get awarded, there will be a contract that will be due by October 2nd. The grant activity period is October 1st, 2023 through September 30th, 2024. So that's also something to keep in mind for whatever project that you're applying to get support for, that your project activity does need to take place between this grants activity period. And then the following year, you're going to have a final. So the project grant, as I mentioned, it's funded by the state through the Louisiana Division of the Arts. And so there are 9 arts councils that manage the program for different regions. So for Arts New Orleans, we are Region 1, which means that would encompass Jefferson Parish, Orleans Parish, and Plaquemines Parish. So with that said, if you're located outside of any of these parishes, you can still apply for the grant. You just need to make sure you're applying in the correct region. So all of this information is the same throughout the whole state. You just want to make sure you're applying in the correct region. So if you accidentally apply in the wrong region, then your application will just be moved to the correct region for it to be reviewed. So just a little bit more about the Louisiana Project Grant. The goal is to provide a system for funding arts projects in all regions of the state by giving individual artists, nonprofit arts organizations, public and private schools, and local government agencies in each region the opportunity to develop an art project that meets their local needs. So the recognized artistic disciplines would be dance, design, folk life, literature, media, music, theater, and visual arts and crafts. So also just making sure that your project does meet one, or if it's multidisciplinary, that's fine, as long as it meets these artistic disciplines. The general eligibility rule is that, like I mentioned earlier, you just have to make sure that you're applying in the correct region, wherever your organization or yourself as artists is domiciled and incorporated. So in the guidelines, there's more information about the eligibility rule, but we're also going to go over it in the presentation as well. Does anybody have any questions so far, just in general, about the program? Nope. Okay. So there are certain things that the grant will not fund. This is something to keep in mind as you're writing out your proposal and the specific things that you're looking to get support for your project. I'm not going to go through each and every one because it's a pretty extensive list, and this is not everything. So I encourage you to reference in the guideline pages 6 through 7, all of the activities and things that the grant does not fund. So that's not to say that it can't be a part of your project. It's just specifically whatever support that you're needing in your project, the grant will only cover certain things. So it's just something for you to review and make sure that, in your proposal, you're not saying, for example, you need the grant to cover food and beverages, because the grant is not meant to cover that, or to provide scholarships. The grant is not meant to cover things like that. Things like activity used for academic degrees, high school, college, or university faculty exhibits, things like that. So just make sure you reference the pages 6 through 7, just to make sure that you're not asking for support for something that the grant does not support. So for the goals of this program, it's really focused on, these are the things that the state essentially is looking for in terms of things about your art project, right? So the goals of the project, they're looking for diversity, equity, and inclusion. If your project or how your project is making an impact or meeting a local community need that utilizes the arts. Increase the level of creativity, innovation, and awareness of new trends in project development. Encourage professional artists to undertake projects that have meaningful community involvement and collaboration, and leverage additional local and national support for the arts in Louisiana. So with that said, the priorities of the program that is emphasized is that it must be an art project that involves dance, design art, folk life, literature, media, music, theater, or visual arts for the purpose of performance, exhibit, presentation, series, or workshop. It must show how the project accounts for the population of the region and promotes diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Focus on learning as an outcome, as well as quantitative outcomes. Cross-parish partnerships between larger urban organizations and their rural counterparts, or vice versa. So even though your organization or yourself must apply in a region that you're domiciled in, your project can still have different partnerships with different people, artists, organizations in different parishes throughout the state. As long as wherever you're domiciled in, you're applying in that correct region. And also projects that have a trajectory to continue to enhance the region beyond the funding period. In terms of the eligibility chart for entities and people that are eligible to apply, as I mentioned earlier, it would be individual artists, given that you have a fiscal agent, which we'll talk a little bit about next. If your organization that needs to use a fiscal agent, you can do that as well. Nonprofit organizations, public and private schools, and local government agencies are all eligible to apply. So something else that you must have is a unique entity identifier. And this may be something new that you may have heard of or you haven't heard of before. It's new as of last year with the federal government, which usually is related to any kind of funding that's coming from federal government. So essentially the Louisiana Division of the Arts, where this money comes from is from a federal program, essentially. So they require something called a unique entity identifier, meaning that they are no longer using a DUNS number. And I know most people are familiar with the DUNS number, but they're no longer accepting a DUNS number, which is completely different from a UEI. So with the UEI number, it's something that you do have to register for. It is free. Everyone go on mute.
Free class.
Make sure. Okay. So registering for the UEI is free. I stress this because some people will or may be contacted by a third party to help you get this number registered. And they will probably charge you. I'm just letting you know right now, this is free to do. This is the website, which Daniel, if you can drop that link in the chat box for everyone. But this website has all the information about how to register for that number. It is a mix of numbers and alphabets. And so the example here is essentially what it looks like. Here at the bottom, this is what a UEI number will look like. So this is also why I also highly encourage everyone to apply for this ASAP, because there has been in the past, for whatever reason, organizations have had some kind of little trouble, not all of them, but some of them. And so if you're having issues or troubles trying to get this number, it may delay you being able to apply for the grant. So I would highly encourage everyone, if you don't have this number already, and this is for organizations, so if you're individual artists, you need to use a fiscal sponsor, that fiscal sponsor has to have a UEI. And so if you don't have a UEI, I would just encourage you to start that process like this week, just to make sure you can get that in time before you submit your application. And also applicants can apply for up to 2 project grants per application cycle. So if you are an organization that is acting as a fiscal sponsor for anyone, you can apply for the grant as well as be a fiscal sponsor for up to 2 other artists or another organization, just so you know. Does anybody have any questions about the UEI or eligibility? No?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So I actually put my question in the chat, but I can ask it here. It says applicants can apply for up to 2 project grants per application cycle. Does that mean that 2 grants can actually be fund or projects can be funded in the same cycle for one organization.
Right. So if you, for example, are you applying as individual artist or organization?
An organization.
Organization, yes. So as long as it's two separate kind of projects, you can apply for the grant. It can't be the same project. It has to be two completely different projects. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I do have a clarifying question. So when you say two different projects, do you mean two different art forms or just two different projects, period? But it could be the same type of art.
Yeah, it can be the same type of art as long as it's two completely separate art projects. Like one application can't be referencing the project in another application. It has to be two completely separate ones.
I had a question. This is Bruce Owen.
Yes.
Okay. It was about the UEI number because that was a new thing to me. The last time we applied for this grant was a couple of years ago. So we still had the DUNS number. Do they need that DUNS number, or is this like a whole new thing?
This is a whole new thing. So you won't even see them ask for the DUNS number on the application.
Okay.
It's no longer being considered.
Okay. Right. So I just started applying for the UEI today, but I keep getting interrupted by various things. So anyway, okay, great, thanks.
No problem.
I have a quick question
Ashley?
about the UEI. If I'm an individual that works in a public entity, do I still need a UEI, or does the public entity need to apply on my behalf?
Are you using a fiscal agent or are you individual?
I am a teacher in a public school system.
Okay, so I believe they also have UEIs. I will double check with Erica at the LDOA, but I believe schools will have UEIs as well.
Okay, so they should have that number, that I would use that number in this eligibility aspect.
Yeah, I would check and see if they have it, especially if they previously have applied for federal, well, previously as in like the past year or so. They should already have a UEI.
Great, I'll check into that. Thank you.
No problem.
Ashley, where will we find the contact for the Louisiana Legislative Auditor?
Let me look into that. I know that to check your good standing with the state, usually we just reference checking the Secretary of State website.
Okay.
And I think that is enough, for you to see if you're in good standing with the state. The auditor thing, I'm personally not too familiar with, so I'll ask Erica about it. But I know in terms of just seeing if you're in good standing with the state, the Secretary State website is good enough.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Nope. All right. So just a little bit more information about the fiscal agent if you are using one. There is some criteria for that you want to just keep in mind whenever you're looking for a fiscal sponsor. And just understanding that the fiscal agent would assume all legal and financial responsibility for the project. And as I mentioned earlier, organizations may serve as a fiscal agent for up to 2 other applicants in addition to their own application. The fiscal agent must be domiciled in the same region as yourself. So just keep that in mind. The fiscal agent may not serve as a provider of service within the same project, meaning that whoever your fiscal sponsor is, you can't hire them for any kind of service for that project that you're applying for the grant for. And the fee may not exceed $150. These are some notes in terms of ineligible applicants. So organizations receiving a line item support from the state legislator. These organizations are ineligible to receive grants for arts program related to those line items. any kind of regional arts council, so none of the arts councils in the state are applying for the grant or eligible for the grant. If you're a past grant recipient who is not in compliance with the Arts Council or the grant program, you would be ineligible. Any organization that is not in good standing with the Louisiana Secretary of State or auditor. So like I said, I'll look into the auditor aspect of it, but you can usually check the Secretary of State website to confirm if you're in good standing. You do have to be in good standing by the time that you apply for the grant. So that's something I just encourage you to look into too. Some organizations don't even realize that they're not in good standing. So I would just double check on the website just to make sure it does say in good standing. That is something that we check, like I mentioned earlier, in terms of checking all the applications for eligibility. This is something that we do check for. We check to see, on the website, if you are in good standing. So just make sure you're good to go on that, as well as with the UEI. So for organizations, even if you have a UEI, you also just want to make sure that it is activated or that it's active, because it's something you do have to renew every year. So again, if you are missing that number or if it's not active, by the time you submit your application and we start reviewing for eligibility criteria, if you don't have that, then that would disqualify your application. Okay. Cash match. So the cash match is something that is also fairly new to the program. The applicants, you must show a minimum of a 50% cash match. And you would also provide documentation in the final report, assuming you get recommended for funding and you receive the grant. Part of the final report is showing where the cash match came from. So for example, if you're applying for a $3,000 grant, in your budget, you have to show a 50% cash match of $1,500 coming from some other source. It can be donations, another grant, things like that. There is a list of ineligible sources for matching funds. So you can't use in-kind contributions, any kind of state funds, funds used for state-owned facilities or equipment purchase, state faculty salaries, administrative costs from state institutions, or funds from the NEA. But anything else outside of that, you would show in your budget that from some other kind of income source, you're able to show that you have enough that shows 50% cash match of the grant that you're requesting. So just something to also really keep in mind. It is possible that projects will not be fully funded. So it's just important to consider additional sources of funding. So, and I think this is just a general thing when you're applying for grants, is that you don't want to show in your budget that the only money that can make this project happen is money for the grant, and you may not get this grant money. So then it looks like you can't do your project at all. Versus the grant money is to, help assist you to do the project, but you should still be able to some extent do the project, even if you don't get the grant funding. So that's essentially what they're looking for in your budget. Here is the evaluation criteria that the panelists are going to be using when they're reviewing applications and scoring them. So 35% of it is going to be artistic merit. Another 35% is going to be need and impact. 20% is going to be planning and design, and 10% is going to be administration and budget. So the grant requests in your application would have to range between $2,500 and $7,500. So again, it doesn't, if you get recommended for funding, it doesn't mean you may receive that exact amount. You may receive a little less. But just keeping in mind that your request does have to be within this dollar amount range, and that whatever you're requesting, that you at least have a cash match to show, 50% cash match to show. Any other questions so far before I get into planning your proposal?
I have a question about the cash match.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if I were to do a GoFundMe for the project, would that count as a cash match, or does it need to be a specific business or sponsor?
No, it can be from any income source as long as it's not any of these ineligible sources.
Okay, cool. And then one more question related to the fiscal sponsor. You mentioned that they wouldn't be. So I wrote a play basically, and there's some festivals I'd like it to be in here in New Orleans. And I was thinking about approaching them to be a fiscal sponsor. If I did that and I got the grant, would that mean I wouldn't be able to do the show in their festival?
So you're asking, if you use the festival as a fiscal sponsor, could you present the project at their festival?
Yes.
That is a good question. I think because, looking at that scenario, you're not hiring them, for your project. You're just using them as a fiscal sponsor and presenting the work at their festival. But let me, I'll double check with Erica.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I'm gonna leave my email in the chat. So if you could just send me a follow-up email about it, and then I'll reach out to Erica about that.
Will do. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Ashley. I have a question.
Yes.
In regards to verifying the 50% sponsorship, can a private company be that fiscal sponsor if they do a promissory note?
A private company, I don't believe so.
So for the matching 50%.
Oh, you're saying for income?
Yeah. So if I had to validate the 50%, that to match, say if I apply for the 75, and I want to pull in the 3750, then if I get a promissory note from a private company, does that fulfill the requirement?
I wouldn't, I guess, use a promissory note because it sounds like it's not guaranteed.
Okay. Or what kind of verification do you need to validate the authenticity of the funds being asked to match?
Well, that documentation isn't asked for until the final report.
Yep.
But for the application, it's essentially shown in your budget. So,
okay, so it's a line item.
Right. So line item.
Okay.
Yes.
That's fine. I can get all of that. I was just curious what your needs were. Thank you.
Yeah. It'll be shown in your budget.
All right.
Anyone else? Okay. So in terms of planning your proposal, these are the things that you want to consider before you apply or you even start filling out the application in terms of what you're looking to get support for. So one being that you, in general, like I mentioned earlier, just really reviewing the guidelines, making sure that you understand what this program is meant to fund and if it's a logical funding source for your project idea. So, and I think this just applies for any kind of grant where you shouldn't be looking at it as, how do I make this project fit the requirement of the grant? It's more so, does this grant already aligned with what I want to do or in what I'm trying to do. Because it's going to be harder to try to apply for something that isn't in alignment and you're trying to force it to fit versus something that already aligns with what your idea is. Also, just thinking about the needs of your community. How is this project going to have a meaningful impact or meet particular needs? These are just going to be certain questions in application that they're going to ask, how you're addressing diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and also just finding concrete ways to demonstrate this, such as letters of support to document community support and collaboration. Involving your community in the planning of the project. Who will benefit from this project? What are their anticipated outcomes? How will you track those outcomes? Are you leaving space for learning? I know particularly for the final report, the LDOA puts the final report together and it's pretty specific in some of its questions. So I highly recommend just if you do get recommended for funding and you receive the grant, that you really keep up with any kind of financial documentation, any kind of measurements, tracking that you've done for the project, that you just have it saved somewhere so you can just easily access it whenever that final report time comes. Also, just being realistic and specific in your plans. Talk to people you want involved in a project before you begin writing. Just a good tip, when you're applying for grants, it's always good to do name drops, organization drops, people that you have relationships with, that you've talked to about who you plan to collaborate with, is really helpful with the panelists understanding the need and the impact that you're going to have and the support that you have for the project. And it's not just something you're just trying to do on your own, but it's something that you've been in conversations with the community or other artists or other organizations, entities, that this is something that will benefit the community. Thinking about your costs, your personnel needs, and the time requirements for your project and just being realistic about that. When the panelists are reading applications, they do, just kind of check to make sure in general, everything flows from your narrative to your budget. So sometimes it is a question that could pop up for panelists where it's like, I see all the things that I'm reading about all the things that you're talking about doing, but does your budget match all these 5 to 10 things that you're talking about doing? Because it sounds expensive, but the budget only calls for like $5,000, so you just want to make sure everything makes sense from the narrative to your budget for the project. Planning for ways to revise the project, but still accomplish it if it needs partial funding. Like I said, you can reach out to me for any questions. I'm available until May 31st. After that, you can reach out to Erica at the LDOA. And like I mentioned earlier, start early. I cannot stress that enough. There have been times where, applicants are submitting or trying to submit like the 2 minutes before it closes and then the internet goes down. Or for whatever reason, the website goes down. It is a third-party website. It's not a website we own or the LDOA owns. So I just really stress to just start early on your proposal, start early on looking through the applications, write drafts, get multiple eyes on it, whatever you need to do before submitting. And like I mentioned, just making sure that your narratives does align with your budget and just getting it submitted early before the 30th, because anything can really happen. So just personal tip. Submittable.com, like I mentioned earlier, it is the grant managing website that we use. It's really user-friendly. The account is free to create. Always save your login information somewhere, especially if you end up getting the grant, because everything is communicated through this website for the grant. So you just want to make sure that you have your login information saved somewhere. Let's see. So after applications are submitted, we have the panel process. The panel, the review panel is a mix of, people with different ethnicities, demographic backgrounds, a mix between artistic and administrative expertise. We really try to, get people that are just a mix of being knowledgeable about the arts community, but also if they have a certain specific experience in something, that would be helpful in the review process. So we do tend to get a lot of applications. I would say, 60 plus. And so because of that, we break up the applications in different groups. And so we essentially have 3 different panel groups. So there's one panel group, they're going to review applications that have performances, theater, dance, music, and multidisciplinary. There's going to be another panel group, they're going to be reviewing applications that are in visual, folk life, literature, festival, design, and media. And the third panel group is going to review arts education. So there is policies to avoid conflict of interest, meaning that if any of the panelists have a conflict of interest with any of the applicants, then they're not going to score on the application. And so they do read the applications through Submittable. They submit their scores, the scores are averaged out, and then we have a discussion meeting to go over the scores, and then they finalize their funding recommendations. So what happens if you do get awarded? If you do get recommended for funding and awarded the grant, you will be notified through Submittable. Submittable will have follow-up instructions. So that's why I said just make sure you have your login information saved somewhere, because you're going to need to continuously have access to your account. You will have a contract that you will sign. And once you sign your contract and the LDOA has sent us, Arts Council, the funds, then we would administer 75% of your grant. So that's also something to keep in mind just in general in terms of you planning your project and when you plan to receive funding, is that you would receive 75% of the grant, but you're required to use all of it by the time the grant activity period is over. And then you would get reimbursed at 25% after you submit your final report. So if anything changes from what you originally applied for your project, just make sure you contact us about it and we'll just kind of see where we go with that. Any kind of project you do have, event, exhibit, performance, whatever that you're putting on, just making sure that you send invites to the LDOA and the Arts New Orleans staff. And any kind of promotional and marketing material, because this grant program is funded by the LDOA, they just require that you have their logo on your promotional material. So these are just things to keep in mind throughout the grant activity period. So you can have everything all in place by the time the final reporting comes. And we're here with questions. That's the end of the presentation, but we'll go ahead and continue with any additional questions. Yes, Michael.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for this. Question about the provider of service form as a part of the grant package. So a lot of our hiring will be done closer to the project, so actual names aren't available. However, we do have the professional outline of each individual hire for the project. I'm speaking of live theater. So our design team, our cast team, we'll all be professional artists, I just don't have names to give them on that provider of service form. Is it fair to do an outline of what the creative team comprises and the level of experience that we solicit in hiring to fulfill that requirement?
Yes, I would definitely be specific in that in your proposal. It's fine if you don't have any solidified, provider of services, but I think you being specific in names in terms of like people you've been having conversations with, or things like that would be helpful in your narrative.
Great, thank you.
Mhm. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question again. Is there a template for the final report that you can share with us at this stage?
No, there isn't. The way that they send the final report is it's attached to your application. So it's not like a separate link that they send out for you to complete. In Submittable, we have the ability to send any kind of additional forms to your application. And so the LDOA will send the final report as an additional form to your application. So I don't have like a blank template.
Okay.
So,
Thank you. And other question is, what is the ratio from the previous years on applicants versus acceptance, the percentage?
I would say about 30 to 40% are accepted. It's a pretty competitive grant, considering that, like for example, I don't know if you're familiar with our community arts grant program that's funded by the city.
Yeah, I did it 2 years ago. That's how I got into this.
Yes, so
Yeah.
that program, is only for arts nonprofits, versus this grant is open to other entities. So I think that in itself makes it competitive. And then it's not a lot of money, to be honest with you. This program, I think for our region, it's about like 127,000. So, and that's kind of split between 3 parishes. Granted, most of the applicants are in Orleans Parish, and we'll have like maybe a couple of you from Jefferson. I don't think we've gotten any from Plaquemines in a while, but that's what just makes it competitive, is that it's open to multiple types of entities, and the funding from the grant program for our region is not very large. So it tends to not have as many applicants as we would like to get funded for the program.
Yeah.
And also it's like the panelists, a lot of times they want to make sure that this is like some kind of, because even the grant amounts are not that big, but if you're going to get awarded the grant amount, it should be somewhat substantial versus these tiny little grant amounts for a grant application that honestly, can take time. So it's like, how do we give these applicants or these organizations or artists the money that they really need to do this project versus giving them like $1,500? That it's not really going to do much. So it tends to make the pool of grantees smaller. Because
Well, that kind of leads to my next question, because my next question was in regards to evaluation and spreading the resources you have. It doesn't sound like you have a weight in regards to a weighted amount, like 7,500 versus 6,000. That doesn't mean there's a weight that you're going to lend more to spread the money. It has to do with the quality versus the quantity. Is that what I'm hearing?
Right, it's quality versus quantity, and also there's kind of like a number formula system that the LDOA has created, to where depending on your grant amount and your score is going to show what your actual grant amount would be if you get funded. If that makes
So you have an algorithm that's kind of set up
Right.
to evaluate that.
Right.
So, and then the last question, sorry, but the money's critical in understanding when you plug in the amount. In regards to ratios, if the program itself, let's say, is a $60,000 program, is there like a ratio that your organization relates to fulfilling a percentage of the total budget for a program, or is that irrelevant?
No, I don't think so. It's really just, I mean, all the money gets used up, and it's really just about what your average score ends up being as an applicant and what your grant request is.
Is there
And
any information we can find out on how to understand that algorithm so we can meet the needs that you're requesting?
No, it's really just based on your average score, like what the panelists end up scoring your application.
Okay, thank you.
That's what it really comes down to, is what your average score is.
Yeah. And thank you for making the time and doing this presentation today. I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, no problem. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for joining. I'm going to stop recording, stop sharing.